Hello and greetings from Victoria, Texas. My name is David Smith. I am going to be talking with you about ministry and the law throughout this conference. First, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am. I'm a grandfather, a father, husband, lover of Jesus, worshiper. This is my family, my wife, Holly, my four kids, my daughter-in-law, and my two wonderful grandkids. And I can tell you, I am very, very, very blessed. I grew up in the Philippines, son of missionaries. Uh, I guess this is me here in mid also about 10, 11 years old, but grew up just in a lifestyle of ministry and just living out the gospel. Ultimately chose to come back to the States, go to college at Baylor University and then to law school and became a lawyer. And I've been a lawyer for over 20 years. Uh, uh, for the last 2 years, I've been the first assistant district attorney in Gonzales County, Texas. Uh, and part of my responsibilities is enforcing the laws of the state, dealing with a lot of very serious crimes. And so I have quite a bit of experience in what I'm going to be talking to you about today. This is my office, a great place to come to work. This is also my ministry. I love being a part of the marketplace, being able to live out the gospel, share the gospel, be able to pray for victims, be able to encourage those around me, and it's really been an exciting time where God has placed me right now. Okay, disclaimer. This is for general information only. It is not specific legal advice for your situation. If you're unfamiliar with the laws of your state or region, definitely consult an attorney. This is just going to be helpful information for you, stuff to get you thinking. Three things we'll be talking about: handling abuse in the ministry, Section 1, Section 2, best practices for screening volunteers and staff, and Section 3, protecting your tax-exempt status. And we'll be handling each of these sections at different times throughout the conference. Section 1, handling abuse in the ministry. You know, whenever we look at the news nowadays, we can't help but see stories of different ministers that have fallen into sexual sin or have had past crimes, come up. Different ministries that are then being held liable for the actions of what the minister of the staff or even volunteers. And we always think whenever we see that, it won't happen here. That's somebody else's ministry. That's somebody else's situation. That's not going to happen to me. But let me tell you that based on statistics, it is very likely that even right now, there are sexual predators around you. There are those who are victims of sexual abuse or physical abuse, and you just don't know about it, aren't aware of it. And so, what do we need to do? We need to be proactive. We cannot assume it's never going to happen to our ministry or to our church or to our organization, but we've got to be proactive in it, and we got to act now. That means getting policies and actions in place to protect your ministry. You've got to think this through ahead, not wait till it happens and then try and figure all this out. So to help us, I'm going to talk a little bit about some observations I made about sexual abuse as I've been trying a lot of these cases, been around this topic for 20 years. First, abusers will seek access to adults and children that are not protected. And unfortunately, churches and ministries that minister to children are a good area. Parent will go and drop their child off at a kids church, Wednesday night kids church. There's always just lots of children, and it's an area that abusers will look for. And it's also an area that those who are looking for vulnerable adults, they'll also look in to churches. And so we as ministers have a responsibility to protect our flock. Now, you cannot tell a sex offender by how they look. It could be any race, any economic status, any background. They could be clothed in the clothing of a minister. You cannot tell just by looking somebody in a room saying, "Hey, that person's a sex offender." You cannot tell. Less than 10% of sexual abuse will ever encounter the legal system. Now, that's an overwhelming stat. That means that almost 90% of sexual abuse that happens is never reported to the legal system. Also, about 90% of victims are abused by someone they know and trust. We have this idea of, this guy in a white van driving along slowly, offering candy to kids, and we tell our kids, "Hey, don't get in the van with strangers." Well, that kind of snatch and grab scenario is a very, very rare scenario when somebody gets sexually abused. 90% of the time, it's somebody they know, they trust, that they love many times. Now, when you talk to victims of sexual abuse, and I'm talking right now just about children, but it can apply to adults, and it can apply to physical abuse, not just sexual abuse. But when I go into a jury trial and I have to select a jury, this slide is one of the slides that I will use every time, and it goes down and kind of I show each line one at a time and have people, about 80, 100 people, kind of hold up their card with each question. And whenever they say, do they know somebody? There'll be quite a few. If the child told right away, very, very few. Child waited months, maybe a few. A child waited till they are an adult. A couple may raise their cards, but then when I get to the bottom, if child never reported it, there's always 10, 12 cards that are raised of children that's never reported it. And so that means that it is incredibly important when abuse is reported. And this is called, in the state of Texas, called outcry. But it's when a child first tells an adult over the age of 18 about the abuse. And if that happens, that is incredibly important. It can be evidence in a trial. You'll be able to tell people what happened, but do not take it lightly in any way whenever something is mentioned. Understand, though, that outcry is a process, that they tell more details over time. Don't expect that you get the full story up front. It's a process of remembering, and just the way the trauma affects the memory. There's no right or wrong way, but just understand that and be gentle with this. First step, you must report it. You must call 911. There are mandatory laws in most of the states that as ministers, we are mandatory reporters. What that means, you need to report it to law enforcement. If you have an insurance company that covers your ministry or your church, you need to report it to the insurance company right away. Uh, Most insurance policies have a prompt response provision, a prompt notification that the longer you wait to tell your insurance company, the more reasons they would have to be able to deny coverage. And especially if you or your organization gets sued, then you're not going to have the benefit of an insurance company coming in to defend you. And if it's a child, mandatory reporting to Child Protective Services or whatever state agency is in your state or region. Now, for churches, we've got to ignore, and ministries, you got to ignore the barriers that are in our ministries and churches and report it. Now, I do not know why ministries at times they'll hear about abuse and think, oh, we need to kind of handle this first. Oh, let's look this out. We don't really want to jump to conclusions or any of those kinds of things. There's this hesitancy, and we can't have that. There is an obligation to report. Let the law enforcement do the investigation, but we must report it. If this is a volunteer or staff person, you must immediately suspend that person. Now, if they're on staff, yes, they can be paid or not paid, just depending on what your decision is. But it needs to be an immediate action. If it's a volunteer, immediately keep them from being around any children. You may end up having to even do a criminal trespass off of your property for the duration of when this is going on. But the main thing is you have to act immediately. You've got to protect the children or the adults, and let a reasonable investigation, play itself out. So to reduce legal liability as a ministry, you basically have to do the right things, okay? Uh, and these aren't that difficult. One, you need to have compassion for the victim and the victim's family. Uh, Sometimes you may know who the offender is. You may consider the offender a friend. You may think, oh, no, he or she is innocent. This couldn't happen. And you think, why is this victim saying these things or do this victim blaming thing? You can't do that. You cannot do that. You just have to have compassion. You've got to let law enforcement handle it. Uh, in talking with attorneys that have sued churches and sued ministries, they say one of the things that is consistent across the board of churches or ministries that get sued is that they do not have compassion for the victim or the victim's family, that they shut them out, that shun them, do different things that alienate the victim. And that's something that will ultimately reduce or increase your risks of being sued. You need to keep information confidential. Don't go around telling the facts of anything, especially as it relates to children. You need to be very, very careful what you say publicly. Speak in generalities. Keep the specifics very, very confidential. But cooperate fully with law enforcement. Give all the information you can to law enforcement, anything that was told. If you're the outcry witness, like I talked about earlier, and you feel like you're the first adult that this child is told, as soon as you've called the police, take a moment and write down everything you remember about that child's statement, because that details like that are going to become very important later on. You also want to if this has happened around you, change the culture and look to improve the policies to prevent future abuse. Um, in our next section, we're going to be looking at some of the policies that you can have that'll help you as a ministry to be able to prevent and reduce the risk of this from happening. I'll see you at the next section. Section 2. Best practices for screening volunteers and staff. Be aware, predators hide in plain sight. Like I said in our last section, you cannot tell a sexual abuser by looking at them. And they tend to very much have a disguise because that's the whole uh, reason they're able to do what they do. If they look like a sleazy, dangerous person, children or adults are not going to come up to them. We're not going to become friends with them. They know how to manipulate. They know how to deceive, and they hide in plain sight. And so we have to be proactive in preventing them to having access. So with proactive prevention, the first thing that every ministry must do is have background checks. This is going to be with staff and volunteers who have frequent contact with the children and the elderly. Before you allow anybody to be on staff or allow anybody to volunteer, they need to have a background check. In today's society, it's very easy to use a background screening provider. There's lots of them on the internet. They'll typically look up criminal histories. They'll look at sex offender registers and at least get a cursory background check. In order to do this, though, you must get written permission. I've prepared a form, just kind of a general form that can be used to do background checks, and I think that's going to be provided to you at some time during this conference. But you have to get written permission from the person that you are doing the background check on. But background checks are not enough. you also, as a part of it, need to have reference checks. Most sex offenders do not have a criminal history. Most sex offenders have not registered. A background check will show a completely clean history. So, what do? We do reference checks. As a part of this check, we'll have them list down a couple of places that they've been serving at before. It's a big red flag if somebody wants to come in and start working with children and they cannot provide any place in the past that they've ever worked with children. But you want to also have this be more than just individual checks because uh, sex offenders at times work together. They know each other and they can put down friends in other states or whatever. And if they just put individual friends, you may not be able to detect anything. But find out about the church they were at before. Call that pastor. Do an institutional check. Find out what people thought about them at the previous church. Now I know that this is difficult to do, especially if you're a larger ministry. But this is one of the things that's kind of the gold standard that can really, as you start individually looking at these things, that you'll be able to start noticing and catching different issues. But in all of this, save your documentation. Whenever you do those background checks and reference checks and you get the results back, throw that in a file, save it on the computer, and just keep it. You don't know at a later time whether you're going to need that to show that, hey, yes, I did do these background checks. Yes, I did do these reference checks, and that's a way to protect you. So I cannot emphasize the importance of background checks and reference checks with every single volunteer, every single staff person. And of course, as you go up into a higher leadership positions, these need to be more in depth instead of maybe a phone call. This needs to be going to the church in person and talking with them. All right. The 6-month rule, again, being proactive prevention. The 6-month rule, what does that mean? That they must attend your church or be a part of your ministry for at least 6 months before having any extensive contact with children or being in any kind of staff or a volunteer position. And not only being a part of everything for at least 6 months, you need to have them plugged in to your culture, into your ministry, not just being on the outside, not just a showing up, and never talking, never engaging, because sexual predators, they don't want to wait. If they know that they're going to have to spend 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, a year trying to have this whole facade before they can get access to a child, they don't like that. And it also helps with adults. You can start kind of seeing, hey, there's something off with this person, but they need to be a part of things. That 6-month rule is really a good rule to have. Training and education. You really need to have some policies and some training that'll educate anybody who will be working with children on abuse prevention policies and recognize predatory signs like grooming. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, a lot of different ministries that have provided different PowerPoints or different trainings, and just having all your volunteers on a Saturday sit down and watch this training or be taught it. And just getting that environment where people know what to be looking for. They understand like this concept of grooming. That's when a predator will start doing kind of nice things for the child or for the adult and just doing things that'll build trust slowly and trust and start kind of slowly isolating them and slowly giving them gifts and just getting them ready that when this horrific thing is about to happen, all the child's guards are down and they're in an isolated spot. But that's something that you can look at and you can see the Holy Spirit gives us discernment in being able to see those types of things. So again, proactive prevention, having training and education. The other thing is supervision. It is important that as far as volunteers and staff, that they are never alone with the child, or for that matter, as far as staff and volunteers being alone with another adult of the opposite sex. Um, the rule of three, having two adults with one child. So this applies to not situations where you have a full classroom of children. Understand if you have you're coming minister, there's 10, 20, 30 children in there. It's all right to have one adult. I'm not expecting that there's two volunteers in there, but when you have that one child that needs to go off and do something. As an adult, you do not go just taking that one child you by yourself. You need to have another adult. You need to have another older teenager if an adult's not involved. But do not put yourself in a position when it's just you and the child by yourself. One way in today's society that we can uh, help in this supervision is with video cameras. If you're a ministry that uses I know this is not for everybody, but if you're at a ministry that is in a stationary building and you around kids, around adults, putting cameras in the classrooms in the corner and in the hallways around the restroom. It can be very, very helpful. I've heard of stories of um, people being accused of maybe physical violence or inappropriate touching towards a child, and there's videotape, so they can go back and look at the videotape and either say yes, this happened, or no, it didn't. And it's also important, in the hallways, in the restrooms. Of course, you cannot put video cameras in the restrooms, but unfortunately, restrooms are one of those places where children can be especially vulnerable, can be especially alone. And that's, having at least video showing who's going in and out of that hallway and in that restroom can be helpful. Our next topic, when we get to our next thing, will ultimately be talking about tax exempt and how we can protect our organizations in that way. See you then. Section 3, protecting your tax exempt status. Now, I know these last couple of sections we've had some harder talks involving abuse and involving the background checks and watching out and protecting. But this comes to now protecting the finances of your ministry and especially that tax exempt status. 501c3 provides tax exemption, but you must follow very specific IRS rules. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I am not a tax attorney. I am not qualified to give you specific tax advice on your situation. I will refer you to this tax guide for churches and organizations with a 501c3. I would also refer you to talking with a knowledgeable accountant or an attorney in your area, because these rules do get very, very specific. And but I'm going to provide just some general guidelines, some things to think about when you're talking about your 501c3 tax exemption status. So some of the best practices for a tax exempt status. Records, records, records. You need to keep records. If you think you're keeping enough records, keep more. You need to collect those business receipts. Everything have some sort of way to be able to prove what you spent, where you spent it, and what it was for. And financial transparency is critical. Anybody at any time should be able to come in, look at your records, and be able to see what you spent on, what you've got income on, and because with tax exempt status, nothing is hidden. And you really have to have some accurate record keeping. But I would encourage you that if you do not have a really good system for keeping records, that you look into getting that, whether it's an online accounting system or something where you can keep up with everything day in and day out. Because it's not going to be, questioning you a week from now. It's going to be questioning you 2 years from now. And you're going to have to be able to look back on those records and say, okay, yes, here's how I justified each dollar I got or each dollar that was spent, and here's the records for it. Very, very, very important in order to keep your tax exempt status. Another tax exempt best practice, you need to act like a business. What I mean by that is in the way that you handle your finances, in the way that you handle your employees, if you have any. Um, you want to use what the traditional business standards, uh, all the different things that a well-run corporation would use to handle its employees, to protect its employees, to protect its business. You want to have all that in place, especially as it regards your finances. Um, I know many ministries, especially smaller ones. If it's you're a one or two person ministry organization, that you keep your ministry information similar to how you keep your personal information. Um, but I'd ultimately advise you that as far as your ministry, that actually needs to be to a higher standard than what you are keeping your personal information and your personal taxes. An example, with employees, you must withhold and pay employment taxes properly. That's just a requirement. You've got to do that. Another best practices, report taxable income. Now you say, hey, we're talking about tax exempt. I shouldn't have any taxes to report. Well, not all ministry income is tax exempt. What I mean is any income that is not wholly related to its tax exempt purpose. Meaning if you're a ministry and say, for example, you have a cafe, but you're operating that cafe for profit, or it's not going back directly into the ministry, or something that really has nothing to do with your ministry whatsoever. Those are things that could be considered income. And so you have to be, very careful to make sure that the income that you get through your ministry is wholly related to your ministry purpose. And if it's something that's um, beyond that, then you need to pay taxes on it. Excuse that. Another tax exempt best practices. You need to file taxes. Just because you are exempt does not mean you just don't file anything. You do have to file. You don't have to pay taxes, but you must file the IRS form 990T each year. I know TMCI gives reminders, encourages that, but that is something that needs to be done. If it's something that you're not comfortable doing, then, like I said before, get an accountant or a tax attorney to help you. But any of the attachments and supporting documentation must be available for inspection. So one of the overriding things that you have to understand with being able to keep a tax exemption for your ministry is that you have to be transparent, you have to be honest, you have to keep paperwork and be able to show that really to anybody, not just to the IRS, but to members of your ministry if they are to ask for it. You just want to be able to be completely transparent, because ultimately, from our perspective, not necessarily from the government's perspective, but from our perspective, all this money is the Lord's anyway, and we are just being good stewards of that, and we should be able to be transparent in being those good stewards. Stuff not to do. Inurement, legal term. What does that mean? Well, it means that charitable organizations are prohibited from taking part in activities that result in individual benefit, and that individual benefit is called an inurement. That means that you cannot take your ministry and use it as a shield to provide income that's only for you. That it's just for your individual benefit. Ministries are supposed to benefit the community. An example of this, a board member's family, they have a business and the ministry has a contract to build something. Well, it goes straight to the family business to build it. Now, you can't do that. That'll result in individual benefit. Everything you do needs to be for the community. When it comes to being, taking salary or income from your ministry, of course you can do that, but it has to be in proportion with the ministry and what you do. Cannot be seen to be solely for your personal benefit. Stuff you can't do, okay? Excessive lobbying. Now, of course, we are in a very political season if you're in the United States right now. So you can do some political lobbying, but it has to be issue driven, not uh, person driven. And if it becomes the substantial part of the ministry, then you can jeopardize your tax exempt status. And so this is something to kind of look at just a little bit deeper, just because this is what we're dealing with right now. And one of the things that they say is that you cannot make any contributions to a political campaign or make any political statements in support of or against a candidate running for office. Now, I know for those who are pastors, there's this tension and kind of gray area between being able to say what needs to be said from the pulpit in support of God's values versus not. And so this idea of kind of being political versus being a public policy advocacy, this is the gray area. Um, what the what the government says is that you can discuss issues of public importance, but you cannot endorse a specific politician or a political party. Um, and this is something I guess you have to be careful of. I think there will be a time in the future that there will be a pastor or a ministry leader that will very specifically be endorsing different people, which happens now, all the time. But then government will try and sue them to take away that 501(c)(3) status, and we'll see what happens there. So it's really something that you need to listen to the Lord on what to do, but just understand that it is something that the government can ultimately try and take away your tax exempt status if you step too much into the political arena. But then at times it's something you may have to do. It's going to ultimately be your personal decision. But ultimately, why this tax exempt provisions are there is it is to allow ministries to be able to devote themselves fully to sharing the gospel, to doing everything without the government taking away funds. And so it's really a good opportunity to be able to use it. Yes, there are some restrictions with it, and just understanding that if you ultimately don't follow those restrictions, that you could lose that 501(c)(3) status. All right. Any questions that you have for me? You can call me. My cell phone is on the screen, 361-676-1974 if you're in United States. Also my email. I'll try and help you if I can, but thank you very much for the opportunity of being able to share with you over these last couple of days.